I was muted. Um, Hi, everyone. Thank you all for tuning in today. And thank you to the Asian Film Archive team for initiating this collaboration with SOFAR, which I'm representing today. SOFAR is an online publication, gallery, and artist incubator that focuses on future-oriented material. Our editorial focuses on issues of global concerns by delving deep into interdisciplinary dialogues across contemporary arts and culture, technology, and design. In this collaboration with the Asian Film Archive, we are gathering in the same spirit to hold a panel discussion as a part of the programming of State of Motion 2021 Alternate Op Realities. The exhibition is currently on view at Marina One, and it's curated by Shahida Iskandar and Tong K.V. And today I'm really honored to have with me a multidisciplinary panel of speakers. Together, we'll deep dive into the language, circulation, and trajectories of platforms that shape our present and our futures. So, the title of today's discussion is Platforms Accidentally, and we'll be talking about platforms and the platformization of nearly everything from products and services to marketplaces and art exhibitions. So before we move on to the panelist introductions, I'd like to give a little bit of an introduction to why we are talking about platforms. So when the internet was born, connectivity and networks were the key terms. We say the internet, the singular web that extends and connects all over the world. But what is our experience of it? So today we open, we scroll, and we jump between platforms. We basically live from one platform to another. And in this sense, the internet has been platformized, and along with it, all the things that we depend on it for. And that goes beyond the computer or the phone screen. For example, Netflix is the platform for home entertainment, and Uber and Grab are platforms for transportation, just to name a few of the most common examples. But I'd also like to give a personal example. So last year, I discovered a recently launched newsletter subscription service called Substack. So while I grew up, turning the pages of the Straits Times, and which for those who are listening outside of Singapore, it's Singapore's English newspaper. Today, my newsfeed has diversified to include not only online editions of newspapers, but also updates and commentaries on topics of interest from my favorite journalists through Substack, which allows readers to receive content directly from the writers that they're subscribed to, directly into their inboxes. But the reason we hear the term platform so much is probably also because platform is also used metaphorically to some extent. So, for example, it would not be outrageous to say that this talk right now is a platform for a discussion. So, it's a platform for perspectives from different disciplines to come together on one plane and be heard. It's also not uncommon to see art galleries or institutions refer to themselves as platforms for emerging artists, for instance, or startup incubators as platforms for innovation. And so we notice that platforms have a rather supportive, community building, and democratic quality attached to it. And especially throughout the last year, they seem to have solved a lot of problems through providing accessibility, connection, and some kind of autonomy. So in the process, we've noticed also a lot of what we're referring to today as accidental platforms, which is where we'll hedge the angle for today's discussion, because platforms is really a very, very broad topic. So over the past year, we've seen an indeliberate uptake of platforms by industries that they were completely unintended for, such as live stream platform for gaming, Twitch. Was previously exclusively being used by gamers, but since the pandemic, it's also being used by musicians and even by some more new media savvy politicians hoping to resonate with a younger generation of voters. We've also seen age-old formats reinvented as digital platforms. So museums and other cultural institutions are a good example. They now have a digital wing. And global fashion shows, for example, now have virtual formats, and many of them are live streaming via several platforms at once. So all these shifts towards platforms, some of them even made from scratch, have occurred in such a quick time that there was hardly time for the creators to learn or even be cognizant of the medium, as if both ends, creators and the users, have stumbled upon platforms accidentally. So there is a book called The Platform Economy, written by the film studies scholar Mark Steinberg. He charts the development of platforms through Japan's mobile internet project in 1999, saying that that was eventually the blueprint for today's mobile platforms of Apple's iOS, iPhone, and Google's Android phones. And he argues that platforms exist more than as technological entities, but more noticeably as constructs that manage and shape us, as well as our relation to everything else in the world. So, with all the buzz surrounding platforms and the emerging critique that comes with it, I hope that today's discussion would provide a portal into some of the fringes of the discourse on platforms. And in view of our upcoming issue on platforms, we hope that the theme today, Platforms Accidentally, will tease out some areas lying in the underbelly of the buzz across sectoral perspectives, which will be, of course, brought to us by our multidisciplinary panel of individuals that I'm delighted to introduce to you. So first we have Jeremy Sim, who is first prototyper at Audacity, a prototyping lab that experiments with humanity-centric future cities. Jeremy is also creative director of Mistletoe, a venture ecosystem builder. I'll stop there and leave Jeremy to tell us a bit more about what all of that means.
Hello. Hey. Yeah, thank you for having me. And I think this is quite a cerebral audience. I'm a very practical guy, so I'm going to use quite simple language. Yeah. So Mistletoe is a family office structure, and it has its roots from the founders' success in gaming platforms. If you're a gamer, if there are gamers in this audience, some of the names might be familiar to you. Gung Ho Online, Supercell, those are two of the better-known gaming platforms out there, from the pioneering days. But nowadays, we tend to do more real-world applications. So we have quite a large startup portfolio, about over 200 startups, from self-driving cars to space startups, sanitation, agri tech, and genomics. Yeah. Oh, there's a little graphic of what we are building. So we built a innovators playground, this prototyping lab. It's a collaboration with JTC, the government infrastructure developer. So it's a partnership between a family office and a government agency for developing infrastructure. And the idea is to create some sort of a playground or community center for young startup founders. And that's my main project nowadays. Yeah. I think there's another slide that I shared, right? Yeah. So this is basically the bulk of my work. I'm double hatting. On one hand, I'm a director of Audacity, and on the other hand, I'm also a creative director with Mistletoe. I don't know if there are many Singaporeans here, but just in case, I'll run through what JTC is. It's Singapore's largest landlord. I understand they have about maybe a third to a quarter of all the real estate development in Singapore. So JTC and Mistletoe, we signed an MOU about 18 months ago to create a model city of the future that looks at addressing a lot of society's greatest challenges. I think climate change is the big one right now. And the project that we're working on is called the Jurong Innovation District. It is actually JTC's largest development in the last 50 years. For those of you who are familiar with Buona Vista One North, this is a development that's 2.5 times the size. And it's a very long-term project. It's a multi-decade project. So, and we are just started the project, right? So Mistletoe, we describe ourselves as a family office or social impact collective. It's founded about 8 years ago. The headquarters was moved to Singapore in 2018. Quite a large portfolio. I think as far as family offices investing in startups, we probably are one of the largest in the world. For those of you who are in the startup scene, these names might be familiar. Astroscale, Ninja Card, Whale, Zipline, Zoox. I think Zoox was acquired by Amazon last year. And a couple of the others, like Ninja Card, has been making the news recently, when Walmart became the latest investor. Yeah, so that was kind of the evolution of the project I'm working on, and the genesis of the organizations behind. In the context of today's discussion, when we talk about platforms, my view of platforms is a bit different. So we've gone from kind of like the gaming world marketplaces more into real world startups. So when I talk about platforms nowadays, I usually mean like genomics, for example, like CRISPR gene editing as a service. The only platform startup incubation I'm involved in right now that's relatable to the context of today's discussion would be something we're working on for robots. We have a stealth project we have tentatively titled the Friendly Robots Playground, which is a platform technology for remote robotics. I think that's enough of an introduction from me right now. I shall turn it over to my fellow guests.
Thanks, Jeremy. That was great. We'll definitely dig into that robotics platform that you were talking about later on. I'd like to introduce Aiwen next. Yin Aiwen is a practicing designer, artist, theorist, and project developer. She also works as a strategist and researcher for cultural institutions. And I'm also pleased to say that Aiwen will be co-editing alongside myself for so far's upcoming issue 4 on platforms. So I'll let her tell us a bit more about what she advocates in her work.
Yep. Thank you, Jing. It's my pleasure. It has been a while to work with so far. We started with the collaboration with an interview about my project Reunion. It's a platform for people to establish a long-term caring relationship with people that they already know. So in a way that we are not exactly a platform, as in we don't really provide people for searching relationship, but rather to let them to the people who have the relationship will have an institutional space where they can actually register their trustful relationship that they believe they can become their family of sort in a society that is aging and increasingly atomized. The reason that I talk about this is also that it's probably the first applied project for my long-term research to search alternative way to design. I start with my career with a huge question on the design discipline itself that is constantly obsessed with the mass communication logic, even with the now that we are onto the mass customization, but the idea is still the same. Who is the audience? Who is the designer? Who are the messengers? None of them matters. What matters is, after all, the quantity of the rich audience. So in a way, I think that I believe design, if go back to the essence, is not a discipline for mass communication, but it is only for communication itself. And for we being human being, there are so many ways to communicate. And I'm interested in a way that communicate that where we actually, as human being, recognize each other as human being, as changing, as a changing being in the world and having multiple possibilities within one body, etc. So I was constantly thinking whether this kind of understanding of human nature, of our relationship with each other, can go into design itself. And my resolution somehow become what I call relationship-focused design, that I want to think about the nature, like if design is not for the machine logic, I sometimes call it, or the mass communication logic, but it's for the logic of preserving relationship itself, what it means to have for human being to have meaningful relationship. What does it mean for us to be a meaningful person being in the world? So so reunion become one of the example that using thinking about care labor as a very specific relational care labor. As a very specific form of labor that who is taking care of you or who you are taking care of is immensely important. The way that you're being taken care of we are being taken care of our parents is very different that is being taken care by any other care worker. So to depart from that, I was thinking if we are designing a platform for respecting and preserving or even empowering this kind of characteristic of care labor, how it would look like. So that's what Reunion has been trying to find out. And what I'm happy in working with so far is that a platform series. It offer a view that is like a critical view on how platformization itself works. How platformization itself has been missing this part in communicative labor, like how platform work from this line of thought that I was just presenting, how it was assuming connecting to people, but it doesn't really connecting because no one in the platform logic is special to anyone. So how do we actually would have meaningful connection with each other is very, very problematic in this sense. So, but I guess I can expand that later in our conversation, but I hope that gives an overview about what I've been working on. Yeah.
Great, we'll definitely expand on that later. Next up, I'd like to introduce Shawn Chua, who is a researcher and an artist, and he is also an exhibiting artist at this year's State of Motion exhibition, Alternate Op Realities, and he'll give us an introduction to his work.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm really inspired by some of the sharings earlier from fellow panelists, and I think there are some resonances that are definitely there. So I'm Shawn, and for State of Motion, myself, along with my collaborators, Ada Adiatma and Ning, have come together to put together this work called Safe Exit. So Safe Exit is a work that questions our relationship to data within the context of medical surveillance, right? So one of the starting points for the project was to think about, what is our data body, right? How are our bodies being reconfigured and, kind of almost like transmogrified by these data infrastructures. How are we experienced by algorithms? But what the work actually is doing is, sorry, Kay, if you can go to the next slide. It's actually it turns Marina 1 as a site into a kind of speculative disease registry. And what happens is that participants would be experiencing the work with and listening to a kind of audio track as they move through different parts of the building as a kind of data body navigating this disease registry. I think one of the starting, so when I was listening to Aiwen speak, I think the thing that really stuck with me was this question about, what exactly is the kind of relationship that we have to one another, what's our relationship with data, and more specifically, what are the politics that are designed into some of these infrastructures, right? When we think about the various technologies of contact tracing and medical surveillance, I think oftentimes we don't necessarily think about, how is the data being used, and more broadly, who is this technology for, right? Who is being protected, and who is being exposed in these relationships? I think, yeah. So one of the things that really, in relationship to this question about platforms, I guess I was thinking about Nick Srinichek's idea of platforms being, what are platforms? Platforms are intermediaries and infrastructures, right? So this is in his book on platform capitalism. And I think the notion of infrastructures was an interesting one that we wanted to play with. How do we begin to retool some of these interaction infrastructures of contact tracing, whether it's like Bluetooth technologies or QR codes, into a kind of dramaturgy that in which audiences are experiencing this work. So yeah, maybe I'll just like stop here for now, and I think we'll have a larger conversation about this later.
I actually think that's a great segue into the rest of the conversation, because you just mentioned what is a platform, and a platform is basically an infrastructure. And I think your work, Safe Exit, it's suggesting that people should be more aware of the platform infrastructure. So my question would be back again to you, Shawn. Why should people be more aware about the platform infrastructure? Should they be more aware about these infrastructures?
Yeah, I think the thing is that right now, I think generally it feels like there might not be much conversation. I mean, these are not questions that are not commonly asked as well, and I think that was kind of the starting point for this project, right? Why is it that we adopt these technologies so quickly without necessarily interrogating a little further what are the ethics or the politics of some of these designs, and with the kind of infrastructures that are introduced during an emergency? Do we also think about what are the exit protocols out of these emergencies as well? And I think one of the questions that is also posed within the work was, this notion of, how did we enter into these registries, right? Or were we actually entered into these registries by someone else? How much agency do we actually have around some of this the data? And furthermore, how is this data then used to make determinations about ourselves, our behavior, our sense of wellness? So in a way, it was really nice to listen to Aiwen's presentation earlier, right? Because thinking about care and wellness, I guess with my work, I'm kind of asking a similar question, but maybe reoriented a little differently to think about how is our body being reconstituted by these infrastructures, and by extension, how and who is determining these kinds of logics of care for us, and for whom specifically. Yeah.
Jeremy, do you have anything to add to that? Maybe you can come back on stage. You're muted.
Hello. Yeah. Oh, by the way, shout out to my friend Justin. He says we need some of our Indian friends on the panel. So maybe I will invite him for the next one, huh? Or we should invite him for the next one. Sorry. So I think when it comes to the subject of platforms, right? Everyone is into platforms nowadays. In the past 3 years, I have attended maybe half a dozen startup events, and together there were maybe 5,000 startups that pitched. And out of those 5,000 startups, I would say between 40 to 50% of them were platform startups. So just in terms of platforms you've never heard of, people are trying to raise money for 2,000 startups in that space in Southeast Asia alone. So everyone is into platforms. But having said that, platforms are by nature neutral. I think they are neither good nor bad. A platform is like a technology, right? It's like AI, it's like a knife, or it's like fire. None of them are good or bad. They're all neutral. It's how you design it and what you use it for. If you design a platform for meaning and fulfillment and kindness and building relationships, that's very different from what we have today. The problem is the platforms that are all being pitched or created or started, right, are all platforms designed for capturing eyeballs that you can sell for advertising dollars. So of course, we have the world we have today, right? So I would say platforms are by nature neutral, but currently the kind of platforms that we are seeing are not designed for the best of use. Yeah.
I think that is it am I audible? Yeah. I think that I do in some way agree that the technology is neutral, but I think we have to be very careful that technology, what level of technology that we're actually talking about. If we are really thinking about like the level of technology that is like you do one thing and then it react to it, that's one kind of technology. The platform is by no means a simple technology. It has a really long process of from how you log into a platform and then how you find people, how you have the conversation, all that. It's a long process. It creates a strong narrative about how you connect to people, how you relate to people, how you value people. So in that sense, that kind of, I would say it becomes a narrative that, and then by no means a narrative will be neutral. So in that sense, I think when we talk about like even going to the sense of like data itself, collecting data is a technology, but how like even the way that it collect how we understand what kind of data is valuable for a platform is already hugely political. I bring one of the example of my the project I mentioned earlier, Reunion. We ask people to sort of tell us how they feel about the relationship by only entering a color. So this is a method that we borrow from psychiatrists, that when they think a people being too analytical, they're alienating from their actual feeling. So they ask them to drawing something by color that is not like strictly analytical or verbal, then they actually being closer to how they feel. So we use that to not only for the sake of like people that don't have to translate their feeling into a systematic logic or language, but also on the other hand, this kind of collecting this kind of data, it becomes hugely interesting to think about data design, because maybe in this room we all select a yellow to describe how we feel about certain relationship, but by no means that we mean the same. So what does it mean for the machine to actually read that data? It becomes completely not processable, or at least it wouldn't work in the whole algorithmic kind of processing sense. And from that, we can starting to think about how we actually create a data that is closer to the user themselves, but more having a more respectful distance from the service provider. And I personally think this could be a good start to think about different way to just design the data, and then with different sets of data, we can create completely different narrative of a platform. Yeah, that's something I want to add.
I think it's really great to hear not only a critique of current forms and models of platforms, but also a proposal for alternative models of platforms. So I'm very curious, Jeremy's perspectives on, perhaps trying a different type of design in initiating a model in platforms or in technologies. And then I'm very curious to hear from Shawn what he thinks about that.
Yeah, I think some degree of anonymization. Blockchain, and when I talk about blockchain, I typically refer to the Nakamoto consensus, which is the ability to decentralize and have some autonomy and control over how much of the data you want to share, which we haven't really seen implemented yet. I feel that it's just around the corner. It is my personal wish and probably my suspicion as well that by the end of this decade, we will shift towards this platforms where they are just basically selling your information to one where there's more agency, right? Yeah, and I think that's probably the more interesting startups space there.
Yeah, I don't know. I think for me, the point about I mean, I guess what was interesting about the way that this conversation was framed is not just about platforms per se, but the accidental nature, right? And for me, that opens up the possibility of what are the kind of tactical subversions? How can we retool these kinds of technologies that I believe are never completely neutral, right? They are inscribed within particular contexts and are used in particular ways. There are always specific politics that we need to unpack a little bit more about. So how can we then retool some of these technologies towards more kind of emancipatory possibilities, right? So that's where the kind of so for me, then the question about accidental is interesting because then I wonder, accidental to whom, right? Accidental to the developers, perhaps, but maybe not accidental to particular populations and communities, right? Who might be operating on very, very different logics from what these developers might be imagining, mostly because these are not the population that is, or communities that are being acknowledged or perceived in whatever ways in the development of these technologies as well. So then the point about, I mean, coming back again to Sunichek's platform capitalism, I mean, I think the notion of infrastructure is an interesting one because it opens up the possibility about, if it's simply an infrastructure, how can it be built upon, right? And can it be built upon in different ways as well that could exceed maybe what the initial architects might have imagined, and how could that? Yeah, I mean, it's not a finished thought, right? But I think the fulcrum that I'm trying to reorientate the conversation for myself is, how do we retool technologies that have oftentimes been oppressive or toxic to particular populations and reorientate, okay, if we use the same technology to create a platform that maybe prioritizes the people who are ill rather than trying to put them away, for example, right? Because oftentimes when you think about medical surveillance, a lot of the kind of violent logics is that we are policing and managing ill people so that the people who are safe don't have to deal with that, right? But what happens if instead of thinking of management and policing that way, we try to force ourselves to imagine a system that prioritizes the well-being and care for them? How would that technological infrastructure provide or open up some of those possibilities? So yeah, I think those are my provocations. Maybe.
I think the bigger picture is the question of how do we design for perhaps a completely unintended or unexpected use case of a platform at the end, or like a few years down the road, or is that how does that come into the design process? As Aiwen has said earlier on, it's a very long process. Maybe Aiwen, you can chime in on that.
Yeah, I really want to jump into that. Actually, I recently just had that huge discussion with. I'm currently in Shanghai, and then in this a co-governed community. They have been super resisting all sorts of establishment, etc. I have been learning from them a lot. And basically with my design thought and also my recent experience is, I think that designer, and I believe in programmer in some sort of way, is also working with a lot of design decision along the way. Anyway, I think we have a huge obsession in to make sure everything will be done in the right way, and then we have a huge kind of obsession in believing our design, our product will capture everyone's whole life. But the thing is, our life, we as human being, our life is always beyond the interface, is always beyond the product. But when we are being the product designer, we cannot accept the fact. We will think that everyone will love our product. We will conquer the world by just having everyone obsessed to the platform. But I recently think that it's really important for designer to have the courage to back off, to let people live their life and believe that people can live their life. And as platform, we see it as infrastructure. And you think about what is infrastructure. Infrastructure is quiet. It's something that is there when you need them. And you don't need to always pay attention to that. But most of the platform doesn't want to do that. Most of the platform want to be your annoying friends that just keep on sending message to you. And you eventually wouldn't think of them as friends. And so, yeah, I think it's also going back to the relationship question, right? How do you wisely having a good relationship with someone sometimes is to let go, to give space for people to be themselves. And then I want to going back to a little, like I wrote a little note for Jingyi's question before, like for design perspective, or at least my line of design research. I think a platform always intended to absorb a lot of communicative labor from the user. So they don't need to go through the painful process of finding the right person to talk to initiate the conversation, to create trust, to make agreement. Every step of the way has huge potential of failure, and then you have to deal with the huge anxiety that comes with that. And as a platform, we want to absorb them as much as possible. We want to promise all our users, like, you'll be fine, even though you're rude, you don't know how to respect people, you get what you want. And I think that's what platform is about, that we want to erase a lot of this kind of uncertainty between the human relationship. So people get what they want and they leave when they get what they need. But people live in this way doesn't have a life, and they wouldn't have real relationship. And I think I want to draw a little bit to the question from Facebook as well. And I think that's one of the reasons that when you mention whether the exponential nature of platforms is problematic, I think, yeah, sure. I think behind the exponential nature is the intention to universalize human relationship and universalize every individuals. For the end of make sure everyone get what they want, we first need to make sure everyone is the same, so that like they can match up immediately, right? Or at least they're always in certain kind of model. So model A will make sure model A will come up together. And yeah, I think I don't necessarily think it's all the fault on the designer themselves, but we are in this kind of culture that we don't want to deal with difficulties. We don't want to spend time, or more like we don't have time for each other. So yeah, it's a mutual thing. It echoes to each other, and then it brings down to the spiral.
So perhaps that brings us to the discussion and some emerging critique on platforms that they are being too human-centric. So it sounds very counterproductive, but a lot of these critiques, they're actually saying that the human-centric approach to platforms, which is, I think, what Aiwen has described as making everything so desirable, so seamless and frictionless and so convenient to use. But desirable for humans doesn't actually mean that it brings our society further collectively. So people who are giving out this critique, they prefer perhaps to look at platforms as systems of coded relations and mechanisms of power that users are produced within. But I want to also draw back to Jeremy's introduction. Jeremy, you mentioned earlier on that Audacity aims to be a humanity-centered model city. So I'm very curious about that choice of term, humanity-centered, and not specifically, human-centered. Can you maybe explain a bit more about that? And perhaps it's also in line with the question that we just got, which was about the exponential nature of platforms.
Yeah. So actually, I wouldn't call us a model city. I think we're trying to build like many different varieties of cities. Because right now, when we think about city buildings, now Singapore, that's a model city, right? And it's a template that's kind of cut and pasted. And of course, with varying degrees of success in the Middle East, in China, in India. So we are building an unmodeled city, or many unmodeled cities. And the reason we chose humanity versus human is humans are just like people. So humanity, we assume that it includes people and the friends of people, which are all the animals and the plants and good air and good water. Yeah. So basically the whole, well, since you guys are mostly artists here, you would be familiar with the Bauhaus movement, which is about 101 years old today. I actually spent a good part of a decade living in Berlin, and in the Thüringer Forest, which is where Weimar is, the capital of the Bauhaus. So I was kind of very exposed to the environment and the kind of thinking. And the Bauhaus 101 years ago was such a dramatic break from the Victorian ornate architecture and design philosophies, right? And the Bauhaus has been very influential. It's shaped like how we do furniture, how we build buildings, even how we live, even our lifestyles today, right? It's still the Bauhaus. But I think the Bauhaus is a very sleek, very skillful interpretation of in the industrialized model for the world. And I think we have just about entered the post-industrial age, like properly, fully. Personally, I believe we are, 15 years, 30 years from a time where industry doesn't make any sense, jobs don't make any sense, even money may not make any sense. And I'm very looking forward to that era. But it's going to be a rocky couple of decades before we get there, which is why we're seeing all these problems in the world. And change never comes easy. Change is always difficult, right? Yeah. And that's true for almost any kind of meaningful change. If you're into fitness, you know that it comes with pain. If you're into bodybuilding, it comes with basically like bashing your muscles and then straining the fibers so they can reform and regrow. And it's the same for societal change. And I think over the next 20 years, it's going to be a very rough ride. In many parts, it's going to be dark and depressive. And our little project is to build a community of people who can keep each other happy until the sun shines again, and play around with different ideas and different concepts for the future. Yeah.
I'm curious what you mean by your people. What does your community look like?
Freaks. Weirdo. Yeah. Well, it's a mix. I think we have a lot of technologists, that's for sure. But we also try to embrace the humanities more. So we have musicians, we have artists. My personal background, I was actually a bookworm. I was very literary when I was young, right? And even as I got older, I started making films with I don't know if he's listening still, Justin Demon, who's, for my book, one of the most talented film producers in the region, and he's inspired me to make a lot of beautiful movies together. So there's always this sense of the aesthetics, and I feel like this beautiful but relatively undervalued aspect of humanity is going to be what's important and most valuable in 20 years. Right now, we're in the last gasp of this capitalistic, industrialized monster when it's about efficiency, when it's about meritocracy, it's about return on investment, it's about how much money you have. Yeah, I'm enjoying it because I know it's the last few years of it. Right? So what comes after that would be the good stuff, hopefully. Yeah.
So I think it's about
I'm assembling all this like people who want to enjoy that part of evolution together. Yeah.
right. So I think maybe it's about time to start rounding up the discussion, and I want to do that by talking a bit about the future of platforms. So Jeremy, you said maybe currently we've just entered the post-industrial age, and it's basically us trying to figure out and make sense of everything, any little small thing around us. And the next 20 years is going to be us trying to find a way out and trying to find a way to make sense of everything. So
can I just add
Yeah.
a little modification? Yeah,
Of
I don't
course.
think we've just entered the post-industrial age. I think we've entered that a long time ago. What we're entering is the last gasp. It's the dying breaths of a giant. Yeah.
Right, right. So earlier on, when I was introducing platformization, I did so with the example of Substack, which is the newsletter service that I'm a subscriber of. So recently I read that Hamish McKenzie, who is one of the founders of Substack, he said, we started Substack because we were fed up about the effects of the social media diet. So I also think about the earlier days of Instagram, for example, where people were going to for so-called cooler content than on Facebook. So my question is this the future? Would we be looking, are we looking at one platform serving itself as a solution for another? Would we be jumping from one to another, and what does that look like? Would that help us make sense of all the very confusing things that are going around us?
Is this for me or is this for the?
Maybe Shawn can respond to that first, and then.
I mean, I kind of dream of a world where platformization isn't the universalizing, homogenizing framework for everything, right? I think something that stuck with me when Aiwen was talking about, I think a lot about non-scalability and frictions, right? What are the things that, I mean, within the work that we were exploring with Safe Exit, I think one of the questions is also, what are the things that should remain illegible or should remain opaque, that should remain encrypted, right? What are the things that we don't want to expose? What are the things that we want to make sure remain outside? Not just outside, but like almost a provocation to remind ourselves that the way in which the platforms organize our relations aren't neutral, aren't just that they are organizing our relations in a very specific way, but that's not the only way, right? So yeah, I'm not sure if that directly responds to your question, but I hope that I guess I imagine the incompleteness of platforms. I think that's something that I wonder how that might look. Yeah.
I think that's definitely a good way to talk about it, because you brought up the conflict between, I'm curious about the conflict between non-scalability and scalability, because I think the question that came in earlier on from one of our audiences was a great question, because they were asking about the exponential nature of platforms. And I think when the allure of platforms is centered on the fact that it is exponential. You're not the content producer, so you don't have to be churning out content and images all the time, but you just have to provide this environment, right? You just have to provide the stage. So it's exponential. But what we're talking about today is maybe perhaps the answer, a nicer way to look at the future of platforms and platformization is maybe knowing where to stop. So I'm curious yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, just a small point. And I think that's where I think Aiwen's propositions about centering relations become a very interesting one for me, because relationships are precisely the things that are not scalable, right? The very specific relations that we have with one another, like those are the things that are being kind of obliterated and smoothed out in the attempt to organize ourselves and our data as these kinds of very ubiquitous, replaceable points within a network. So yeah.
Aiwen, maybe you'd like to voice that.
Yeah, I think scalability, I guess it's important to figure out what precisely is needed to be scaled up and what precisely cannot. I think that everyone does need relationships. So to have that's one of the reasons what the reunion trying to offer. We do have so many relationships in our lives. Some of us, some of those relationships that we treasure, but cannot having an institutional space to fit in. So we try to offer that. But we don't try to universalize or trying to find a standardized metric for all the relationship to meet certain requirement. We're trying to leave that space to human, and we're trying to leave the building up relationship process to human. We're trying to be not so obsessed with making sure all the relationship on the platform is right. That's one of the reasons that we don't want to offer matching people to find what's your next long-term relationship should look like, because I think that it's just first of all practical reason we can afford that kind of liability. Like, how can you make sure someone will be long-term there for you, right? But also on the other hand, it's just for a platform to let go of this part and then only be there when people do their work for a relationship, and then they are determined, they committed, and then they have a space to go to. So we want to scale up in terms of how diverse the relationship can be can be hosted, but we don't want to scale up for people to have a short-term exchange. And as for Jing, your initial question, for me is further platformization is really hard to continue simply because capital cannot really sustain. To have a big platform, it means you have to have immense infrastructure that needs a lot of money and a lot of labor to sustain. But then platform works because they are cheap for each unit of user. And people already get used to very cheap servers and or even free servers. I wonder how many business models out there would be actually sustainable for further platformization and not just a capital burnout game for that. And I think eventually the capital will cool down, and then our life will kick in. Our reality, COVID is a really good reality kicks in, and people has to it's just not only for the money side, they has to come down because it's not sustainable, and then people also will realize, and I think we already have been realized, we cannot rely on the screen. Our life needed to be so much more than just the screen. So I think that time will actually come very soon, and if not already collapsing. So yeah.
Jeremy, curious to hear from you.
Yeah, I think I'm almost coming from the opposite direction, right? So my first social media platform was Facebook 4 years ago. And I only signed up for it because I was dating a girl who was working in Facebook. So I felt I had to support her. So for the decade before that, from the mid-2000s to 2017, I was living in a forest in Germany without even a mobile phone. So a lot of this angst against technology and social media, right? Because I'm a late joiner to the game, I'm sort of like an outsider looking at it. I think a lot of it is garbage, and some of it is useful. And I really have no strong opinions. the opinion that I do have is that I believe in a diversity of options, and it seems that right now the world has too many options for stupidity and shallowness, and not enough options for depth and meaning, right? So if there's anything I would like to focus my energy on, it would be to deliver kind of this kind of alternative options, and whether it's a platform or not, I really don't care.
That's definitely an interesting perspective. That's definitely an interesting perspective. So, do you think that platforms will still be relevant in the next cycle of technology?
So that depends on the participants, which is all of us, right? And I would say we are seeing the beginning of what has been called the global brain, right? And I think platform technologies would be the body in which it manifests. And the fear of artificial intelligence, I think, is a very legitimate one. And technology platforms will become distribution channels for artificial intelligence, right? So, and we're probably, I don't know, pretty close to the time where it's beyond human control. Yeah, which is why I'm really enjoying the ride right now, because you know, even though we talk about capitalist pigs, but at least these are human capitalist pigs. It'd be interesting when we shift to non-human, whatever that is managing the world. Yeah. So I don't know how the world will turn out. I just know that we should all enjoy the ride, get our hands dirty, and try to shape it and steer it in whichever direction we damn well please. Yeah.
Okay, I think on that note, we can end today's discussion. We've hit the hour mark. For those of you who are in Singapore, but who have not seen State of Motion 2021 Alternate Op Realities, I think it ends tomorrow, 21st of February at 8 p.m. at Marina One. And I think I think it was great. It was a great discussion, and Shawn's work, Safe Exit, actually kind of speaks to this idea of perhaps deplatformization of an individual. So on that note, thank you all for joining us today. Thanks, Jeremy, Aiwen, and Shawn, for this very interesting discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy your weekends.
Yeah. Okay. Ciao, ciao.